Father's Day had always been a day filled with warmth and tradition in our house. Claire would plan every detail to make it special. A heartfelt card from our daughters, Emma and Grace, followed by a backyard barbecue or a family outing to the lake. The day held even more meaning when it coincided with my birthday, a rare and cherished overlap. Those moments made me feel truly seen and valued as a husband and father. This year, however, a subtle shift had crept into the air. Claire, usually so attentive to dates and celebrations, seemed unusually distant in the week leading up to the day. When I casually mentioned the upcoming weekend, expecting her usual excitement about the plans she undoubtedly had in store, her responses felt evasive, almost mechanical. She brushed off the topic entirely, as though it were a minor inconvenience rather than a meaningful occasion. When the day arrived, I woke up early, hopeful but apprehensive. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that carries a weight, one that seemed to settle heavily in the pit of my stomach. As I made my way to the kitchen, I noticed no signs of celebration. No special breakfast, no handmade cards on the counter, nothing. It was as if the day held no significance at all. Claire emerged later in the morning, preoccupied and already dressed in casual beach attire. She barely acknowledged me, moving through the motions of getting ready with a distracted air. There was no explanation, no effort to include me in whatever she had planned. The only sounds breaking the silence were the soft padding of Emma and Grace's feet as they followed their mother's hurried steps. Before I could process it, they were gone, off to the beach for the day, leaving me behind without so much as a second thought. The hours that followed felt endless. I tried to distract myself with mundane tasks around the house, but everything seemed hollow. Memories of past Father's Days lingered in my mind, mocking me with their warmth. The absence of laughter, of shared moments with my family, left a gnawing emptiness I couldn't shake. When they finally returned that evening, their arrival was marked by the sounds of sandy shoes on the floor and the girls' voices bubbling with stories about their day. Claire, however, barely glanced in my direction. Her focus remained entirely on Emma and Grace, as if my presence was an afterthought. She moved through the room with a detachment that felt almost deliberate. As I sat there, the realization began to take root. This wasn't just an off day or a simple oversight. Something had shifted in our marriage, something I couldn't yet define but felt deeply. The warmth that had once been a constant in our home seemed to be slipping away, replaced by an unsettling distance. For the first time in years, I felt like an outsider in my own family, and I couldn't shake the growing sense of unease that this was only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, Claire's behavior became harder to ignore. It wasn't just the indifference she'd shown on Father's Day. It was in the little things that used to bind us together. Our evening conversations, once filled with stories about the girls or shared plans for the future, grew sparse. Claire would retreat to her phone or bury herself in work, leaving me to sit in the quiet, wondering if I had done something wrong. There was an unfamiliar rhythm to her days now, one that didn't seem to include me. She began coming home later than usual, offering vague explanations about errands or work commitments. When she did get home, there was a stiffness in her demeanor, as if being in my presence required effort. The warmth she once carried into the house, the laughter that used to echo in the evenings, was gone. I told myself it was just a phase. People go through rough patches, I reasoned. Maybe she was stressed or dealing with something she didn't know how to share. But as the weeks turned into months, her actions only became more puzzling. She started paying unusual attention to her appearance, something I wouldn't have questioned before but now couldn't ignore. She bought new clothes, styled her hair differently, and spent more time in front of the mirror. It wasn't just her physical transformation that unsettled me. There was a secrecy to her actions, an effort to shield parts of her life from me. I noticed her phone was always within arm's reach, often tilted away when I walked by. Conversations would end abruptly when I entered the room, replaced by an artificial brightness in her tone as if nothing had happened. There were nights when she claimed to be working late but returned home without the exhaustion that usually followed a long day. I started waking up to find her texting or scrolling through her phone in the early hours of the morning, her face illuminated by the screen. When I asked about it, she would dismiss my questions, offering answers that felt rehearsed and hollow. It was during one of these late-night moments that the unease began to settle into something heavier. I couldn't name it then, but the feeling lodged itself in my chest and refused to leave. Something was wrong. The woman I had built my life with, the mother of my children, was slipping away from me, and I didn't know how to stop it. I started keeping track of her patterns, not out of a desire to control her but to make sense of what was happening. I noticed her growing disinterest in family moments, the way she'd excuse herself from meals or gatherings with vague mentions of work. Even the way she interacted with the girls felt different. Still loving, but distant, as if part of her was elsewhere. The distance between us wasn't just emotional anymore. It felt like a chasm, widening with every passing day. And the more I tried to bridge it, the more Claire seemed to pull away. My attempts to reconnect, to bring back the woman I had fallen in love with, were met with polite indifference, leaving me to wonder if she even noticed how hard I was trying. It wasn't until I overheard her on a phone call, her voice soft and laced with a nervous energy I hadn't heard before, that my suspicions started to solidify. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was enough to send my mind racing. For the first time, the thought crossed my mind that perhaps I wasn't imagining things. Perhaps there was more to her behavior than I had dared to consider. The realization was like a crack in glass. Small at first, almost imperceptible, but impossible to ignore once seen. And as I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that our marriage was headed for something I wasn't ready to face. It's strange how your instincts sharpen when you feel something is wrong. I began noticing things I would have overlooked before. At first, they seemed like minor details. A dinner receipt stuffed into the trash from a restaurant Claire and I had never visited, or the faint smell of cologne clinging to her jacket, a scent that wasn't mine. She'd mentioned being with coworkers, but when I casually asked about them, her stories didn't add up. Names changed, details shifted, and timelines blurred. Once, she claimed she'd been at a meeting downtown, but I found a parking receipt from a lot near the beach. These weren't outright lies, but they were cracks in her facade, small enough to make me doubt myself yet large enough to keep me awake at night. I started paying closer attention, not because I wanted to play detective but because I couldn't help myself. Her phone, once left casually on the counter or nightstand, was now always locked and out of sight. If she did check it in front of me, her face was an unreadable mask, and the screen was tilted just enough to keep me from seeing. One evening, as I was cleaning up the living room, I noticed her laptop was left open on the couch. Normally, I would have walked past it without a second thought, but something made me pause. I told myself I was just curious, but deep down, I knew I was looking for something. Anything that would explain her behavior. Her email was open. Most of it was work-related, but then I spotted an unfamiliar name in her inbox, someone she didn't talk about. The subject lines were vague, the kind of placeholders people use when they don't want to draw attention. Catch up soon, or good to hear from you. My hand hovered over the mouse, but I couldn't bring myself to click. Whatever was in those messages, I wasn't ready to see it. The following week, Claire went out one evening, claiming she was meeting an old friend for dinner. I stayed home with Emma and Grace, keeping busy with their homework and bedtime routines. But even as I read to them, my thoughts were elsewhere. It wasn't just Claire's absence that bothered me. It was the growing weight of not knowing what was happening in her life. When she returned that night, she seemed lighter, almost glowing in a way I hadn't seen in months. I watched her as she floated into the kitchen, humming softly to herself, as if the weight she carried around me had disappeared for a while. It should have made me happy to see her like that, but instead, it felt like a dagger twisting in my chest. The next day, I noticed her purse sitting on the dining table. The zipper was open, and a folded piece of paper stuck out from the edge. I hesitated, battling the growing need for answers against the guilt of invading her privacy. But my curiosity won. The paper turned out to be a printed receipt from the night before. It wasn't for a casual dinner with an old friend. It was for 2 entrees, a bottle of wine, and dessert at a restaurant I'd heard her mention once. One of those places with low lighting and overpriced dishes meant for special occasions. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the receipt as my heart pounded in my ears. This wasn't the Claire I knew. The woman I married wouldn't hide things from me. She wouldn't turn a simple dinner into a secret, and she certainly wouldn't lie about it. That evening, when Claire came home from work, she greeted me with the same polite indifference that had become her new normal. She didn't notice the receipt, now tucked away in my pocket, or the way my eyes followed her every move. The weight of suspicion was becoming unbearable. I found myself replaying every moment of our relationship, searching for signs I might have missed. But nothing prepared me for the realization that the person I had built my life with might be keeping secrets that could shatter everything we had. I wasn't ready to confront her yet. Instead, I let the doubt fester, knowing it was only a matter of time before I'd have to face the truth. The days following my discovery of the receipt were some of the most isolating of my life. I couldn't shake the weight of it, that small slip of paper now hidden in my desk drawer, a tangible reminder of everything I feared. Every time Claire walked into the room, my chest tightened. Her smile, her laughter with the girls, none of it felt real anymore. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was innocent. Maybe she had caught up with an old friend, and the receipt didn't mean what I thought it did. But the more I tried to convince myself, the more the evidence seemed to pile up. Her late nights, the distance between us, the carefully concealed phone, it all painted a picture I didn't want to see. One evening, I found myself standing in the kitchen after Claire had gone to bed. The house was dark and quiet, but my thoughts were loud, relentless. I poured myself a drink, hoping to quiet them, but it didn't help. I stared at my reflection in the window above the sink, trying to find answers in my own weary eyes. What was I supposed to do? I couldn't accuse her without proof, but the thought of pretending nothing was wrong felt impossible. Every interaction with her was tinged with suspicion now, every glance a potential clue. I hated feeling this way, like some paranoid fool who couldn't trust his own wife. The following weekend, Claire told me she had another work event. She didn't offer many details, and I didn't ask. I just nodded, watching her pack her bag with a level of precision I hadn't seen before. She left the house around 6, kissing the girls goodbye but barely sparing me a glance. I spent the evening with Emma and Grace, trying to distract myself with movies and popcorn. But even as I laughed at their jokes and answered their endless questions, part of me was elsewhere. I couldn't stop picturing Claire, imagining where she was and who she might be with. After the girls went to bed, I sat alone in the living room, scrolling through my phone but barely registering anything on the screen. Then, almost without thinking, I opened the app we use to track our family's location. It was something we had installed years ago for safety, back when the girls were little and Claire was nervous about school pickups. Her location pinged downtown, nowhere near the office she had claimed to be heading to. My stomach dropped as I stared at the map, watching her little icon hover near a row of upscale restaurants and boutique hotels. I closed the app, feeling like I had just crossed a line I couldn't uncross. My heart raced as I tried to decide what to do. Should I call her? Should I confront her? But what if I was wrong? What if there was a perfectly logical explanation, and I was just overreacting? Hours passed before she came home. It was well past midnight, and the sound of the front door opening jolted me out of my restless thoughts. I stayed on the couch, pretending to watch TV as she entered the house. Claire didn't look surprised to see me awake. She simply gave me a tired smile, muttering something about the event running late before heading upstairs. Her shoes clicked against the wooden stairs, each step echoing in my chest. I waited until I heard the bedroom door close before I got up and walked to the kitchen. Her bag was on the counter, carelessly placed in her rush to get to bed. The urge to look inside was overwhelming, but I stopped myself, gripping the edge of the counter until my knuckles turned white. I couldn't keep living like this, questioning everything, doubting her every move. But the alternative, confronting her and risking everything we had built, felt just as terrifying. For the first time, I started to wonder if our marriage was already broken beyond repair. The thought was unbearable, yet it clung to me like a shadow, growing darker with every unanswered question. The tension in our house became a living thing, pressing down on me day after day. Claire's behavior didn't change. It was still the same mix of cool detachment and carefully maintained normalcy. But now, every moment felt like a test of my patience, my composure. I had questions boiling inside me, but I couldn't bring myself to ask them. Her late nights became more frequent. The excuses she gave were flimsy, the kind you offer when you assume no one will push back. She was working late, she said, or catching up with friends from her old office. But her explanations lacked detail, and when I probed just slightly, she brushed me off with a forced smile and a quick change of subject. One evening, as I sat at the kitchen table, the weight of it all became too much. The girls had gone to bed, and the house was quiet except for the sound of Claire moving around upstairs. I stared at the small pile of mail in front of me, but I couldn't focus on the words. My thoughts were consumed by images of her, smiling in ways I hadn't seen in months, laughing at jokes I hadn't told. I needed to know the truth, but the fear of what I might find held me back. The Claire I had known, the woman I fell in love with, built a life with, had always been honest and loyal. If I was right, if she was hiding something, then what did that say about her? About us? The next day, I decided I couldn't sit idly by anymore. I told myself it wasn't snooping, that I had a right to know what was happening in my own marriage. While Claire was at work, I went to her closet and opened the drawer where she kept her personal items. Things like receipts, old notes, and forgotten trinkets. At first, it looked like the same disorganized pile I had seen 100 times before. But buried beneath it, I found something that stopped me cold. A small velvet bag, the kind you'd find at a jewelry store. My hands shook as I opened it, revealing a delicate bracelet I had never seen before. It wasn't extravagant, but it was elegant. Something thoughtful, something personal. The tag attached to it read, "To see, for every moment that's ours." I stared at the words, their meaning sinking in like a weight in my chest. Whoever had given her this wasn't just a casual friend or coworker. This was someone who cared deeply, someone who thought they shared something special. I placed the bracelet back in the bag, careful to leave everything as I found it, and closed the drawer. My mind raced as I sat down on the edge of the bed, trying to piece it all together. Claire's recent behavior, the late nights, the growing distance, it all made sense now in a way I wished it didn't. That evening, I couldn't even look at her. Every word she said grated against my nerves, every smile she offered felt like a lie. When she asked if something was wrong, I mumbled that I was just tired. In truth, I was exhausted, drained from carrying the weight of what I now knew but wasn't ready to confront. Over the next few days, I found myself watching her more closely than ever. I analyzed every move she made, every glance at her phone, every hurried text she tried to hide. The bracelet was proof of something, but I didn't know how far it went. Was it emotional? Physical? My mind churned through every possibility, each one more painful than the last. The breaking point came one night when she left for another supposed work dinner. As I sat in the empty house, the silence felt suffocating. I opened the location app again, my heart pounding as I watched her icon move across the map. It wasn't headed for the office or a restaurant, but a residential neighborhood across town. I stared at the screen for what felt like hours, watching as the icon stayed in the same place, unmoving. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was certainty. And with that certainty came a resolve I hadn't felt before. When Claire finally came home, she moved through the house quietly, probably assuming I was asleep. But as I sat in the dark living room, waiting for her, I realized there was no more avoiding the truth. The confrontation I had been dreading was no longer optional. Tomorrow, I would ask her. Tomorrow, I would demand answers. And no matter what she said, I knew our lives would never be the same. The morning came with a heaviness that hung in the air, thicker than any storm cloud. Claire moved through her morning routine like it was any other day, unaware that I had spent the entire night awake, rehearsing what I was going to say. My stomach churned as I watched her sip her coffee, scrolling through her phone like nothing was amiss. When the girls left for school, the house became unnervingly quiet. Claire sat at the kitchen table, her attention still fixed on her phone. It felt like the moment I had been dreading and preparing for in equal measure had arrived, whether I was ready or not. I sat down across from her, my heart pounding in my chest. She didn't look up at first, but when she finally met my gaze, there was something in her expression, something wary, like she sensed what was coming. I didn't launch into accusations. Instead, I began with the smallest details, the late nights, the unexplained absences, the way her stories never quite lined up. My voice was steady, but every word felt like it was cutting through me as much as it was cutting through her. Claire's face remained calm, almost too calm, as though she had rehearsed her responses. She denied everything at first, her tone measured and controlled. But the more I pressed, the more cracks began to show. Her denials grew sharper, defensive, as though my questions were more offensive than the actions I was accusing her of. I told her about the bracelet, about finding it in her drawer. Her face fell for a moment, just long enough for me to catch the flicker of guilt before she quickly masked it with indignation. She claimed it was a gift from a friend, brushing it off as though I were overreacting, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. I didn't stop. I brought up the location app, the night she had spent in places that had no connection to work or her so-called friends. I laid everything out, piece by piece, until there was nowhere left for her to hide. Finally, her composure broke. Her face flushed, her voice rising as she accused me of spying, of being paranoid, of trying to control her. But her words only fueled the fire burning inside me. I didn't care about her deflection. I wanted the truth. Eventually, the fight drained out of her. She sat back in her chair, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. For a long moment, she said nothing, staring past me as though the weight of it all was finally pressing down on her. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but firm. She admitted to meeting someone, a friend, she called him at first. But as I pressed for more, the truth spilled out in fragments. It wasn't just friendship. There had been dinners, long conversations, and moments that went beyond anything she could explain away. The words hit me like a blow, each one confirming what I had feared for weeks. My chest tightened as I struggled to keep my voice steady, to stop the room from spinning around me. She tried to justify it, talking about how she had felt neglected, how she had been searching for something she claimed was missing. Her words felt like daggers, each one twisting deeper as I realized she was trying to shift the blame onto me. I didn't argue. I couldn't. All I could do was sit there, letting her words wash over me, a mix of anger, betrayal, and heartbreak threatening to consume me. When she finally fell silent, I stood up and walked out of the room. I didn't trust myself to speak, didn't know what I could say that wouldn't break me further. I needed space, needed to process the wreckage of what she had just admitted. As I sat alone in the bedroom, staring at the wall, I realized there was no coming back from this. The woman I had trusted with my life had betrayed me, and no amount of explanations could erase the damage that had been done. The next steps were unclear, but one thing was certain: the life I thought I had was gone, and I would never see Claire the same way again. After Claire's admission, the house felt like a battlefield in the aftermath of a war. Quiet, but charged with an unspoken tension that lingered in every corner. We didn't speak much in the days that followed. She tried to go about her routine as if nothing had changed, but the cracks were impossible to hide. I avoided her as much as possible. Every time I looked at her, the weight of her betrayal hit me all over again. I found myself questioning everything, every moment we'd shared, every promise she'd made. How long had this been going on? How much of our life together had been a lie? The girls seemed to sense that something was wrong. Emma, ever the perceptive one, asked me if I was feeling okay. Her question caught me off guard, and I forced a smile, telling her I was just tired from work. Grace didn't say anything, but I caught her watching us during dinner, her wide eyes darting between Claire and me as if she were trying to piece together a puzzle she wasn't meant to see. Claire didn't help. She played the role of a concerned wife in front of the girls, but her attempts felt forced, hollow. When we were alone, her facade dropped entirely. There were no apologies, no signs of remorse. Instead, she carried herself with a strange mixture of defiance and guilt, as if daring me to confront her again. One evening, as I tucked the girls into bed, I found myself lingering in their room longer than usual. Emma was reading, her brow furrowed in concentration, while Grace was already half asleep, clutching her favorite stuffed animal. I watched them for a moment, a lump forming in my throat as I thought about how their world was about to change. I had always promised myself that I would do whatever it took to give them a stable, loving home. But now, that promise felt like a weight I couldn't carry. How could I protect them from the fallout of something so deeply personal, so devastating? The next morning, I decided to take a step I had been avoiding. While Claire was out running errands, I called a lawyer. It felt surreal, explaining my situation to a stranger, laying bare the most painful parts of my life. The lawyer was professional, calm, and straightforward, but his words only made the reality of my situation hit harder. I didn't commit to anything right away. Part of me still clung to the hope that maybe, somehow, things could be salvaged. But another part of me knew that hope was a lie, one I was telling myself to avoid facing the inevitable. When Claire came home that afternoon, she found me sitting at the kitchen table, the lawyer's business card tucked into my pocket. She hesitated in the doorway, her eyes flicking to mine before looking away. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of control. I wasn't ready to tell her what I had done, but I knew now that I had options, that I wasn't trapped in this nightmare she had created. That night, as I lay awake in the dark, I thought about the life we had built together, the family we had created. I thought about Emma and Grace, and the home I had tried so hard to make a safe haven for them. And I thought about the man Claire had turned to instead of me, the man who now stood as a symbol of everything I had lost. I didn't have all the answers yet, but one thing was clear: the life I had known was gone. What came next would depend on how willing I was to fight for what mattered most, and how much I was willing to let go. As the days turned into weeks, the tension between Claire and me seeped into every corner of our lives. The walls of the house seemed to hum with the weight of it, an unspoken war that both of us refused to fully engage in. But even silence has a way of spreading, and soon enough, the cracks started to show in places I hadn't expected. Emma and Grace grew quieter, their usual chatter replaced by careful glances and hesitant questions. I tried to shield them from what was happening, doing everything I could to keep their lives as normal as possible. I still helped with their homework, still took them to their activities, still sat with them at night to read stories or talk about their day. But no matter how much I tried, I couldn't stop them from sensing the shift in the air. Claire wasn't as careful. She avoided family dinners altogether, claiming work or errands or some other vague excuse. When she was around, she was distracted, her attention fixed on her phone or lost in her own thoughts. The girls noticed. Emma, always braver than her younger sister, asked me outright why Mom didn't eat with us anymore. I dodged the question as best I could, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. The breaking point came one Saturday afternoon. Claire had taken the girls out for ice cream, a rare gesture that I hoped would help ease the growing tension. I stayed home, grateful for the chance to gather my thoughts. When they returned, however, it was clear that things had not gone as planned. Emma stormed into the house first, her face red with anger. Grace trailed behind her, tears streaking her cheeks. I hurried to meet them, my heart sinking as I looked from one to the other. Through tears and angry outbursts, I pieced together the story. While they had been out, Claire had taken a phone call, a long one. Emma had overheard enough to recognize the tone, the way her mother laughed and softened her voice in a way she hadn't in months. When Claire hung up, Emma had confronted her, demanding to know who she had been talking to. The argument had escalated quickly. Emma accused Claire of lying, of keeping secrets, of caring more about her phone than her family. Claire, caught off guard, had snapped back, telling Emma to stay out of things she didn't understand. Grace, caught in the middle, had burst into tears. As Emma recounted the fight, her voice wavered between anger and sadness. She wanted answers, but more than that, she wanted reassurance, something I wasn't sure I could give her. Claire entered the house a few minutes later, her face pale and her expression guarded. She tried to brush past me, but I stopped her, my voice low but firm. I told her we needed to talk, now, not later. The conversation that followed was one of the worst we'd ever had. Claire refused to admit any fault, insisting that the girls had misunderstood the situation. I countered with everything I had, her absence, her secrecy, the growing distance between her and the family. Her defenses crumbled under the weight of it, and for a brief moment, I saw the guilt flash across her face. But instead of apologizing, she lashed out. She accused me of turning the girls against her, of poisoning their minds with my suspicions. The words stung, not because they were true, but because they were so far from the man I was trying to be. By the time the argument ended, we were both exhausted, the house heavy with the aftermath of everything we'd said and left unsaid. I found Emma and Grace in their room, sitting side by side on Emma's bed. Grace was still crying, and Emma had her arm wrapped protectively around her sister. I sat with them for a long time, struggling to find the right words. I told them that no matter what happened, I would always be there for them, that I would always love them. It was all I could offer, but as I held them close, I realized it might not be enough to shield them from the storm that was tearing our family apart. The next morning, Claire barely spoke to me. The girls were distant, too, their usual energy replaced by a quiet wariness. For the first time, I saw how deeply this was affecting them, how much they were caught in the middle of something they couldn't understand but couldn't escape either. It was then that I knew the situation had reached a breaking point. It wasn't just about Claire and me anymore. It was about Emma and Grace, about the life we had promised them and the home we had built together. I couldn't let the fracture between Claire and me destroy everything else. But as I looked across the breakfast table at my daughter's sad, confused faces, I realized I wasn't sure how to fix what was broken, or if it could be fixed at all. The tension in the house had reached a point where even the simplest moments felt heavy. Conversations were clipped, the silence between Claire and me a constant reminder of the growing divide. The girls remained cautious, watching us as if trying to predict the next eruption. I hated that they were caught in the middle, but no matter how much I tried to shield them, the fractures were too visible to hide. It wasn't long before Claire's family got involved. Her sister, Mia, called one evening, her voice laced with concern. She had noticed Claire withdrawing from family gatherings and behaving differently, and she wanted to know what was going on. I hesitated, torn between protecting Claire's reputation and the need to vent my own frustration. Eventually, I told Mia a version of the truth. Claire had become distant, there were issues in our marriage, and I wasn't sure what the future held. Mia listened quietly, and when I finished, she sighed deeply. She told me she had noticed Claire acting secretive over the past few months, often stepping away to take calls or brushing off questions about her personal life. Mia's words confirmed what I already knew. This wasn't just my imagination. A few days later, I came home to find Claire's parents sitting in our living room. It wasn't unusual for them to stop by, but the tension in the air told me this wasn't a casual visit. Claire sat stiffly on the couch, her arms crossed and her face unreadable. Her mother, a soft-spoken woman with a warm but no-nonsense demeanor, was the first to speak. She asked how things were going between us, her tone gentle but probing. Claire shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my gaze. I wasn't sure how much Claire had told them, but I decided to be honest, at least partially. I spoke about the strain in our marriage, the growing distance, and the difficulty of balancing our responsibilities as parents with the challenges we were facing. I left out the specifics, hoping to spare the girls and avoid escalating the situation further. To my surprise, Claire didn't contradict me. She sat silently, her gaze fixed on the floor as her parents pressed her for answers. Her father, usually reserved, finally spoke up, his voice firm but kind. He told Claire that whatever was going on, it was her responsibility to address it, to be honest with herself and with me. Claire didn't respond, and after an awkward silence, her parents excused themselves, leaving the house feeling even heavier than before. That night, as I sat in the quiet of the living room, I realized how much the secrecy was affecting everyone around us. Claire's refusal to address the truth wasn't just tearing us apart, it was dragging the people who cared about us into the chaos. The breaking point came when Emma found something she wasn't supposed to. She had been looking for her tablet in Claire's bag and stumbled across a small envelope. Curious, she opened it and found a folded note and a photo of Claire with another man. Emma came to me, her face pale and her hands shaking as she handed me the envelope. My heart sank as I unfolded the note, which was short but damning. To see, for all the moments that are ours. Always yours. The photo was worse. It was a candid shot of Claire and the man, sitting close at what looked like a cafe, their expressions too intimate to be mistaken for friendship. I hugged Emma tightly, telling her everything was going to be okay even as my mind raced. I could feel her small frame trembling against me, and it broke something inside me to know she had seen this. I confronted Claire that night, the envelope clutched in my hand as I stood in the kitchen, waiting for her to come home. When she walked in and saw me standing there, her face froze. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't throw accusations. I simply placed the envelope on the counter and asked her to explain. For a moment, she looked like she might try to deny it. But then she saw the exhaustion in my face, the weight of everything I'd been carrying, and something shifted. Her shoulders sagged, and the mask she had been wearing for months finally fell away. Claire admitted to the affair, though she tried to downplay it at first. She said it wasn't serious, that it had been a moment of weakness, a distraction from the stresses of life. But the words felt hollow, her excuses too rehearsed to be genuine. I listened, numb to the explanations she offered. The damage was done, and no amount of justification could undo it. As I stood there, staring at the woman I had once trusted more than anyone in the world, I realized there was no coming back from this. The life we had built together was shattered, and all that remained were the pieces, and the question of what to do with them. The days after Claire's confession felt like living in the aftermath of an earthquake. Everything was familiar, but nothing felt stable. I went through the motions of daily life, helping the girls with school, going to work, but inside, I was a storm of conflicting emotions. Anger, sadness, betrayal, even a strange, hollow sort of relief. Claire's admission had finally given me clarity, but it was clarity I didn't want. The life we had built, the woman I thought I knew, were both gone, replaced by a stranger and a shattered marriage. She tried to talk to me a few times in the following days, but I couldn't bring myself to engage. Her apologies felt shallow, her attempts at explanations only made things worse. She insisted the affair hadn't meant anything, that it was over now, and that we could still fix things if we both tried. But I couldn't bring myself to believe her. The betrayal wasn't just in the affair itself. It was in the months of lies, the distance she had put between us, and the way she had dragged me into a fog of doubt and confusion while pretending everything was fine. The girls, of course, knew something was wrong. Emma stopped asking questions, but her watchful eyes followed me everywhere, like she was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Grace clung to me more than ever, her quiet, nervous energy a constant reminder of how much this was affecting them. One evening, after the girls had gone to bed, I found myself sitting at the dining table, staring at the lawyer's card still tucked into my wallet. The thought of divorce had felt like a distant possibility at first, but now, it loomed over me, heavy and inevitable. I thought about the girls, about how this would turn their world upside down. I thought about the life Claire and I had shared, the promises we had made to each other. But more than anything, I thought about what staying in this marriage would mean, not just for me, but for all of us. The next morning, I called the lawyer. The conversation was straightforward but difficult. I asked questions about custody, about how to protect the girls from as much of the fallout as possible. The lawyer assured me that we could work through it, that the process could be as smooth or as contentious as we made it. When I hung up, I felt a strange mixture of dread and relief. For the first time in months, I had a plan, a way forward. That evening, I sat Claire down after the girls had gone to bed. I told her about the call to the lawyer, about my decision to move forward with the divorce. Her reaction was a mix of shock and defiance. She accused me of giving up too easily, of throwing away everything we had built over a single mistake. I stayed calm, refusing to be drawn into another argument. I told her this wasn't about revenge or punishment. It was about doing what was best for all of us, including the girls. Her protests softened as she realized I wasn't going to change my mind. For the first time, I saw real regret in her eyes, but it wasn't enough to sway me. I had spent months trying to hold on to something that was already broken, and now, I couldn't do it anymore. As Claire retreated upstairs, I stayed at the table, staring out the window at the quiet street outside. The house was silent, but the decision I had made felt like the loudest thing in the world. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be questions from the girls, judgments from family and friends, and moments of doubt and pain. But as I sat there, I felt a small glimmer of hope. Hope that, somehow, this decision could be the start of something better, for me and for my daughters. The life I had known was over, but maybe, just maybe, that wasn't the end of my story. The hardest part was always going to be telling Emma and Grace. I'd played out the conversation in my mind countless times, but no amount of preparation could make it easier. They were still so young, their world so small and innocent. How could I shatter that and still call myself a good father? A few days after my conversation with Claire, I decided it was time. I couldn't keep the tension in the house from them forever. They deserved the truth, or at least as much of it as they could handle. It was a Saturday morning, the kind that usually meant pancakes and cartoons. But that day, the air was heavy, even as the sun streamed through the kitchen windows. Claire had agreed to sit with me as we broke the news, though her presence felt more like an obligation than support. We gathered the girls in the living room, their wide eyes looking up at us expectantly. Grace sat close to Emma, clutching her stuffed animal tightly, while Emma tilted her head slightly, already sensing the seriousness of the moment. I took a deep breath, steadying myself before I began. I told them that their mom and I loved them very much, that we always would. I explained that sometimes, even when people care about each other, they can't live together anymore. I tried to keep my voice calm, even as the words felt like stones dropping into a still pond, sending ripples through the room. Grace's eyes filled with tears almost immediately. She asked if that meant we wouldn't all live in the same house anymore, her voice trembling with fear. I nodded, my chest tightening as I reassured her that no matter what, both her mom and I would always be there for her. Emma didn't cry, but her face was a mask of quiet devastation. She asked why this was happening, her voice steady but laced with a depth of understanding that made my heart ache. I wanted to tell her everything, to explain the betrayal, the lies, the hurt. But I couldn't burden her with that. Instead, I told her that sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes mean they can't stay together. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was enough for now. The conversation stretched on, filled with questions I didn't have answers to and reassurances I wasn't sure I believed myself. Claire sat mostly silent, her occasional contributions stilted and hollow. I could tell Emma noticed the tension between us, her sharp gaze flickering back and forth as if trying to read what we weren't saying. When it was over, Grace clung to me, burying her face in my chest as she sobbed. Emma stood quietly nearby, her expression guarded as she processed everything. Claire eventually left the room, retreating upstairs while I stayed with the girls, holding them close and trying to comfort them as best I could. That night, after the girls had gone to bed, I sat in their room for a long time, watching them sleep. I thought about everything they would face in the coming months. The confusion, the pain, the uncertainty. I thought about how much I had wanted to shield them from this, how powerless I felt now that it was happening anyway. But as I sat there, I made a promise to myself. No matter what happened with Claire, no matter how messy or difficult the road ahead became, I would be there for Emma and Grace. I would be their constant, their anchor, the one thing they could always count on. Because in the end, they were the only thing that mattered.